In the first half of the 19th century, the United States was a nation standing on the edge of a precipice. The land stretched wide and wild, from the Atlantic coast to the frontier plains. Railroads carved new lines through untouched wilderness. Factories poured smoke into the skies of northern cities, and cotton, that delicate white fiber, grew like snow across the deep South. To the casual eye, America seemed unstoppable, a young republic racing toward prosperity. But beneath the surface, invisible tension simmered like pressure beneath a sealed cauldron. Every field plowed by enslaved hands, every shipment counted in the docks of New York, and every new mile of railroad track whispered the same question: who truly owns the future of this country? Historians have written thousands of pages about the Civil War. They describe it as a tragic but inevitable clash, a struggle between North and South, freedom and bondage, union and disunion. Yet, when one looks closer, the pattern of events begins to feel almost too precise, too carefully arranged, as if unseen fingers had been turning the gears long before the first cannon fired on Fort Sumter. To understand the hidden story, we must travel backward, to the quiet boardrooms, the drawing rooms of Europe, and the secret lodges that span continents. There, far from the battlefields, plans were drafted in candlelight. The war that would tear America apart was not only born of political debates and moral outrage. It was also fed by gold, debt, and the relentless appetite for control. By 1820, the Missouri Compromise had already revealed the fracture lines. Every new state admitted to the Union threatened to tip the balance between free and slave territories. In Washington, men argued over principles. In London and Paris, bankers and industrialists argued over profits. American cotton clothed the European poor, American tobacco sweetened their evenings, and American railroad promised a future of continental power. But such power frightened the monarchs of the Old World. What if this republic, built on independence and self-rule, grew too strong? What if its model inspired revolutions that might burn across Europe? The idea of a self-sustaining, debt-free nation was a threat to every empire financed by aristocracy. Whispers began to circle in salons and trading houses. The United States must be divided before it became untouchable. And division, history shows, is best sown not by invasion but by influence. Through banks, through trade, through the subtle manipulation of credit, an empire could be bent without a single musket raised. American merchants, desperate for capital, turned increasingly to European financiers. London's powerful houses extended credit lines to southern planters. French investors poured money into rail projects. On the surface, it seemed like progress. Beneath it, a quiet dependency took root. By 1837, the American financial system convulsed in panic. Banks collapsed, farmers lost their land, and factories fell silent. Yet foreign creditors seemed curiously unaffected. It was as if the strings of America's young economy were being tested, pulled tighter with each crisis. Then came the question of the future: industrial North or agrarian South, free labor or enslaved labor. Both systems produced wealth, but only one fit into the grand design of Europe's financiers. Slavery, brutal as it was, made the South a single-crop economy dependent on British textile mills. Independence for the South meant continued profit for those mills. A unified, industrial America, on the other hand, might become a rival. It was during these decades that secret networks, the Freemasons, the Knights Templar revivals, and, later, the Knights of the Golden Circle, began to intertwine politics with ritual. Some lodges were harmless fraternities. Others whispered of destiny, empire, and control. Many leaders of both North and South shared membership in such circles, believing themselves bound by higher purposes. But what if some of those higher purposes were not divine at all? What if the lodges served as quiet meeting points for men who intended to steer the young nation toward their own ends? In the early 1850s, America's expansion westward intensified. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the wound that had barely healed. Newspapers screamed, mobs rioted, and the word secession began to echo in state legislatures. Yet behind the fury of politicians were financiers speculating on land, railroads, and war supplies. Every crisis meant new contracts, new loans, new opportunities for control. Abraham Lincoln was still an unknown Illinois lawyer when these tides began to swell. But his speeches, cautious, logical, and deeply moral, carried a tone that unsettled the powerful. He spoke not only of union and liberty, but of independence from private banking interests. Few paid attention then, but those who did mocked his name. As the election of 1860 approached, Europe watched closely. The Rothschild network, through intermediaries in New York and London, maintained correspondence with both northern industrialists and southern exporters. Whoever won would owe debts, whoever lost would default. Either outcome offered profit, but a divided America offered power. In November 1860, when Lincoln won the presidency, the stage was set. Within weeks, Southern states began to secede. Yet many of the armed shipments that would later equip Confederate troops had already been ordered months before the ballots were even cast. It was as though someone had known the script in advance. Conspiracy or coincidence? Consider this. Ships laden with weapons left European ports under neutral flags. American agents purchased them through shadow companies financed by British banks. Confederate representatives arrived in London seeking loans. They were welcomed by bankers who claimed neutrality, yet charged usurious interest that would bind the South to European debt for decades. At the same time, Northern financiers aligned with New York banking interests pressed Lincoln's government for high-interest war loans. When he resisted, he found the Treasury nearly empty, the country's own currency supply strangled by private control. That was when Lincoln made his fateful decision, the greenback. But that chapter belongs to later in our tale. For now, imagine the air in Washington on the eve of war, thick with tension, cigars, and fay. In back rooms, congressmen whispered of secession and compromise. In counting houses, bankers calculated the profit of bonds and munitions. And somewhere across the ocean, in a quiet office overlooking the Thames, a man smiled faintly at the unfolding drama. He did not need to lift a sword. His weapon was credit. His victory would be measured not in lives saved, but in interest accrued. The American Civil War was coming. Yet long before the first shot was fired, the war for control of America's soul had already begun, waged in ledgers, contracts, and secret correspondence sealed with wax. The smoke before the fire was not gunpowder. It was a smoke of burning paper, agreements, treaties, and letters that no historian would ever read. And so, as dawn rose on the spring of 1861, the Republic faced its fate. Two armies would soon march toward each other, each believing itself righteous. Neither would know how carefully the path had been prepared for them. In the distance, cannons waited in silence. And behind the silence, unseen hands counted the profits of war. The first shots of the Civil War had barely echoed across Charleston Harbor when another, quieter battle began in the marble halls of finance. While soldiers drilled on muddy fields, men in tailored suits watched the smoke through gold-rimmed spectacles and calculated how much each volley was worth. To the world, the conflict appeared to be about the Union and Confederacy, about freedom and bondage, about the moral destiny of a young republic. Yet in counting houses from New York to London, the language of war was not liberty or justice, but credit, interest, and collateral. The United States in 1861 was broke. Years of expansion and speculation had drained the Treasury, and private banks held most of the nation's gold. When Lincoln took office, he inherited a country rich in land and spirit but poor in coin. Congress had authorized only limited borrowing power, and the government's paper money, demand notes, was worth less each month. Into this crisis stepped the bankers. They offered help, but at a price. Their proposal seemed reasonable on paper. They would purchase government bonds and issue currency backed by those bonds. In practice, it meant that every bullet, every uniform, and every soldier's ration would be paid for with borrowed money. The war would be financed not by the people but by private capital, and that capital would collect its due long after the guns fell silent. Lincoln hesitated. He had come from humble roots, knew the scent of debt, and distrusted it. He wanted a currency born of the Republic itself, not of a handful of financiers who already controlled the nation's railroads and industries. But the bankers were relentless. Newspapers they influenced warned of financial ruin if the government refused their terms. Lobbyists crowded Washington hotels, whispering of patriotism while calculating profit margins. Across the Atlantic, the same houses that had funded European wars looked west. The Rothschild Consortium in London, the Barings, the Erlangers in Paris, all watched the American conflict with interest that was more than intellectual. A divided America meant weak markets, cheap cotton, and new opportunities to lend. The Confederacy, desperate for recognition, offered cotton bonds, securities payable in the very fiber that clothed Europe. To investors, it sounded irresistible, gold in the form of thread. By the winter of 1862, the South had sold millions of pounds of cotton abroad. On paper, ships carrying the real cargo were trapped by the Union blockade, but the bonds circulated freely in European capitals. For a time, the paper itself became more profitable than the cotton it represented. Even if the war destroyed plantations, the interest would still accrue. Meanwhile, in the North, bankers demanded up to 36% interest on short-term loans to the government. It was financial blackmail disguised as patriotism. Lincoln finally broke. On February 25, 1862, he signed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing $150 million in United States notes, the greenbacks. They were not backed by gold or silver, but by the faith of the people. It was an audacious experiment, and one that enraged the money power. Contemporary letters from Wall Street brokers record their fury. "The president assumes to manufacture money," wrote one trader, "as if he were God Almighty." Yet on the streets of America, the green bills spread hope. Soldiers accepted them, merchants traded with them, and for the first time the Republic itself, not private bankers, issued its own lifeblood of credit. In London, a circular began to circulate among influential financiers warning of the dangers of Republican paper money. It urged the creation of a future system in which all nations would borrow from private central banks, never again trusting governments to control their own currency. Whether this document was official or apocryphal, its sentiment would echo through later decades. The war raged on, but in the ledgers of European counting houses the outcome mattered less than the interest payments. Bonds sold in 1861 matured in 1871, 1881, 1891, stretching profit into the future. Every month of bloodshed was a month of dividends. And as thousands died at Shiloh, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, a new class of men rose quietly above the smoke. The war financiers, whose fortunes were measured not in acres conquered but in numbers printed. Lincoln's greenback circulated like a pulse through the veins of the Union. Farmers accepted them with cautious optimism. Soldiers folded them into letters home, proof that the government stood behind its promises. But inside the financial district of New York, men muttered about inflation and rebellion in equal measure. Gold prices soared. Speculators bought and sold the new paper currency as if it were a battlefield of its own. The administration fought back with another act, the National Banking System of 1863. It tied private banks to federal bonds, forcing them to hold government debt if they wanted to issue notes. On the surface, it unified the country's money. Underneath, it tethered every local bank to Washington's fortunes. To some, it looked like order. To others, it looked like a quieter kind of conquest. Across the Atlantic, investors read dispatches with mixed emotion. British mills suffered from the cotton famine, their workers idle while southern ports lay under blockade. Pamphlets circulated accusing the Union of tyranny and pleading for recognition of the Confederacy. Yet the British government held back, wary of a war with the North. For London's financiers, neutrality was more profitable than intervention. As long as both sides borrowed, both sides served the market. In Paris, the banking house of Erlanger and Company struck its now famous deal with Confederate envoys. The Erlanger loan, issued in 1863, promised bondholders cotton at a fixed price, an ingenious pledge for a commodity none could deliver. European investors lined up to subscribe. The paper boom was instantaneous. Speculation replaced certainty. Even in defeat, the Confederacy was enriching someone. Letters from the American minister in London warned Washington that the war is discussed here not as a moral struggle, but as a question of dividends. He was right. In the private clubs of Mayfair, men toasted the courage on the battlefield while calculating yields on American securities. When the tide of battle shifted, they hedged accordingly, moving gold from Confederate to Union accounts. Lincoln saw this and despaired. He confided to close allies that the money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of war. Whether those exact words were his or later legend, they captured his growing frustration. He believed that the same invisible forces financing both sides would one day re-enslave the country through debt, and in that belief lay the seed of future conspiracy theories. After Lincoln's death, pamphlets would claim that international bankers ordered the assassination to punish him for the greenbacks. Historians find no solid evidence of such coordination, yet the idea persists because the timing felt uncanny. A leader who defied the traditional money order died just as his experiment triumphed. To a public weary of manipulation, the notion of unseen avengers felt plausible. Meanwhile, the machinery of finance kept turning. By 1864, government borrowing had reached unprecedented levels. Jay Cooke, the Union's chief bond salesman, used patriotic advertising to sell debtors duty. Buy a bond, save a soldier, the posters declared. Millions responded. War became a subscription, and victory a matter of installments. When the fighting finally ended in 1865, the numbers told their own story. More than 600,000 dead, billions in property destroyed, and an unpayable national debt that would define economic policy for generations. The financiers had risked little and gained everything: influence, precedent, and proof that modern war could be waged on borrowed money. Yet beneath the triumph lay unease. The greenbacks had worked. They had carried the Union through its darkest hour without the constant mediation of gold. If the Republic could finance itself once, why not again? That question frightened those whose wealth depended on scarcity. The debate over who should control the nation's money would outlive the war itself, erupting again in the populist revolts of the late 19th century. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields, a new kind of empire stood waiting, not of territory, but of credit. The soldiers went home, the generals wrote their memoirs, and the bankers locked away their ledgers. The next generation would inherit a peace built on paper. And in that paper, the ghosts of the war would continue to whisper. The war that raged across America was never truly confined to American soil. Cannon smoke drifted only as far as the horizon, but its echoes reached London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. In the drawing rooms of Europe, ministers and magnates watched the struggle as if it were a play whose outcome might redraw the map of world power. For Britain, the dilemma was cruelly simple. Its textile empire depended on southern cotton. Its moral conscience leaned toward abolition. In Lancashire, mills stood silent, their looms idle for want of raw fiber. Thousands of workers starved, yet crowds gathered to cheer the Union cause. It was a contradiction unique to an industrial democracy, sympathy for liberty mixed with economic despair. Inside Whitehall, debates raged behind closed doors. Foreign Secretary Lord Russell spoke of mediation, perhaps recognition of the Confederacy. Others warned that a divided America would invite chaos across the Atlantic. Prime Minister Palmerston hesitated. Britain's fleet ruled the seas, but it could not rule public opinion. Any overt support for slavery might shatter the moral facade of the empire. And so Britain chose a weapon subtler than muskets: finance. London's banks extended quiet credit to both sides. Confederate agents such as James M. Mason and John Slidell negotiated loans, arms, and warships. The notorious raider CSS Alabama, built in a British yard, slipped to sea despite official neutrality. The Union protested. The builders smiled and invoked legal loopholes. When the ship lay to burn Union commerce on the high seas, its profits flowed not to Richmond but to shareholders in Liverpool. In France, Emperor Napoleon III watched with fascination and calculation. He dreamed of restoring French influence in the Americas, establishing a friendly monarchy in Mexico under Archduke Maximilian. A Confederate victory, or even prolonged stalemate, would keep Washington too busy to interfere. French newspapers, some guided by imperial censors, painted Lincoln as a tyrant and the Southern cause as a quest for independence. Yet official recognition never came. France, like Britain, preferred to profit quietly rather than gamble openly. Rumors later claimed an envoy from secret European orders, the so-called Continental Lodges, met Confederate representatives in neutral ports, promising assistance if the South could guarantee cotton deliveries and political alignment. No document confirmed these tales, but they fed a powerful narrative that the old world was conspiring to fracture the new. What is certain is that the war became a global economic experiment. European insurers underwrote blockade-running ventures. Shipyard from Glasgow to Bordeaux worked overtime. Even neutral nations traded in contraband through intermediaries. Gold moved in intricate circuits, sometimes financing opposite armies in the same week. The conflict proved that in the age of steam and telegraph, war itself could be international business. Russia, curiously, broke ranks with Western Europe. Tsar Alexander II, who had recently freed his own serfs, sympathized with the Union. Two Russian fleets, one in New York, another in San Francisco, anchored in American waters in 1863, an unmistakable gesture of friendship and a subtle warning to Britain and France. Some conspiracy writers later claimed a secret alliance between Lincoln and the Tsar to resist European banking power. Historians find no formal treaty, but correspondence shows genuine warmth between the two emancipators. In an age of imperial rivalry, Russia's gesture gave Washington breathing space. By late 1863, European hopes of Southern victory faded. The Union blockade tightened. Cotton prices collapsed. Investors who had speculated in Confederate bonds faced ruin. British journalists turned their pens. Sympathy for the Union rose again as news of emancipation reached the public. The same editors who had once hinted at recognizing Richmond now praised Lincoln's moral resolve. Markets follow sentiment as much as logic, and by 1864 London was once again buying Union bonds. The great foreign powers had played their game and lost little. They had tested America's resilience, profited from her suffering, and learned how easily information and money could cross oceans. When the war ended, diplomats would congratulate themselves on restraint. Bankers would quietly total their gains. The soldiers who returned home knew nothing of these distant calculations. Yet, in every tavern tale and every whispered letter that crossed the Atlantic, one idea survived, that the fate of the United States had been a matter of interest not only to Americans but to the whole world's financial empires. The American Civil War had become more than a domestic conflict. It was a theater where the world's most powerful financiers experimented with influence and control. In the smoky halls of London's financial district, whispers carried farther than telegrams. Men in dark coats spoke of liquidating risk and hedging political outcomes. It sounded like ordinary trade, yet each number scratched on a ledger might mean another shipment of rifles to the south, or grain to the north. For the bankers, ideology mattered little. What mattered was interest, and behind every neutral transaction stood a familiar name, the House of Rothschild. To the public, the Rothschilds were Europe's unrivaled financial dynasty, a web of brothers controlling banks in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Their network could transfer millions across borders in hours, a speed unmatched by any government. Conspiracy theorists later claimed the family played both sides of the war, loaning to Washington and Richmond alike. The truth, as always, is less theatrical yet far more intricate. The Rothschild London branch leaned toward the Union, partly out of moral stance, partly because Britain's long-term interest required a stable America. But other European financiers, eager for Southern cotton, invested in Confederate war bonds sold through private brokers in Paris and Amsterdam. In those years, the line between private enterprise and political manipulation blurred completely. A single bond sale might shift public opinion in a foreign capital. A delay in a gold shipment could slow an army's pay. Wars, once decided by generals, were now also fought by accountants. Cut to an archival montage, ledgers, telegrams, cargo ships vanishing into mist. As Confederate fortunes declined, the hunt for money grew desperate. Agents like Jacob Thompson and Clement Clay roamed Canada and Europe, negotiating shadow deals. They offered concessions, trade rights, even future influence in a southern empire stretching into Latin America. But investors had begun to smell defeat. The market was merciless. It abandoned lost causes as easily as it created them. Then came a new rumor, one that would survive long after the last cannon fell. Some claimed that European monarchies secretly wanted the Union destroyed, fearing that a strong, unified republic might inspire revolutions at home. If the United States could prove that democracy worked, it would threaten every throne in Europe. By this logic, dividing America was not just strategy, it was self-preservation for the old world order. Letters from European diplomats hint at this anxiety. Reports of Paris and Vienna warned that the spirit of the American experiment, if victorious, could inflame liberal movements across the continent. Better to see the Republic humbled than triumphant. Whether this sentiment ever shaped policy remains debated, but the fear was real. By 1865, when Richmond burned and Lee surrendered, those fears faded with the smoke. America had survived. Yet in the shadows of the peace, conspiracy theorists found fertile ground. They saw in every banker's note and every foreign ship a symbol of manipulation. They argued that the Civil War was less a moral crusade than an economic chess game, one orchestrated by unseen global hands. The narrator pauses, voice low and reflective. Perhaps it was not pure fiction. The world was learning a dangerous lesson, that financial power could bend nations as easily as armies. In that realization lay the seeds of every conspiracy to come, from whispers about central banks to tales of global elites. As the 19th century marched on, America would rebuild, industrialize, and expand westward. But some would say that her soul had been mortgaged to the same financiers who had watched her bleed. And when a new generation later faced the creation of the Federal Reserve, they would recall these same names, these same fears, and ask the same question: who truly controls a nation, its elected leaders, or those who fund them? The Civil War was not won on the battlefield alone. It was also fought in the vaults, in the counting rooms, in the sleepless mind of a president staring at ledgers he could barely balance. By 1861, Abraham Lincoln's greatest enemy was not the Confederate Army. It was bankruptcy. The Union Treasury stood empty. Revenue from tariffs had collapsed. Gold reserves were vanishing. Foreign investors were skeptical. Every musket, every ration, every mile of railroad demanded money the government did not have. Lincoln turned to the nation's bankers. They met him politely, respectfully, and refused him coldly. They would lend, they said, but only at interest rates so high that the war might as well be lost before it began. To their minds, risk demanded reward. To Lincoln, it smelled like extortion. Then came an idea so radical it bordered on madness. The government would create its own money. Thus were born the greenbacks, paper dollars not backed by gold, but by the authority of the United States itself. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized $150 million in this new currency. It was a direct challenge to the power of the private banks, and a miracle for the soldiers who needed pay. At first, the notes were mocked. Lincoln's rags, the critics called them. Merchants refused them. Foreign creditors laughed. But the war machine kept turning. The government used its own promise as collateral, and somehow it worked. The greenback became the lifeblood of the Union economy. Behind the patriotic triumph, however, grew the roots of a new suspicion. If the state could conjure money from paper, what stopped it, or anyone else, from doing the same? Where did value truly come from? Gold, labor, or faith? In secret memos, some of Lincoln's advisers warned that this power would draw enemies more dangerous than armed rebellion. They were right. Wall Street financiers saw in the greenback a threat to their dominance. If government-issued money succeeded, private banking might never again control the nation's credit. Some later writers claimed this was a moment when Lincoln signed his own death warrant, not from Southern bullets, but from financial revenge. They cited letters, anecdotes, coincidences. Historians dispute every one of them. Yet the myth endures that the president who dared to free both men and money challenged interests too vast to forgive him. The greenback circulated like wildfire, bright, green ink, stamped with Lincoln's promise and the words United States note. Soldiers accepted them. Shopkeepers began to trust them. The Norse factories roared back to life, fed by a current of money that owed nothing to gold. But beneath that miracle, a quieter storm gathered. In the parlors of New York's financial district, the decision was seen as blasphemy. The man in the White House, one banker allegedly said, has dared to play God with the nation's currency. Bankers feared not inflation but irrelevance. If the Union could print its own credit, who needed their loans? Speculators moved quickly. They began to hoard gold, driving up its price to undermine the greenback's value. Newspapers screamed about Lincoln's paper experiment, predicting ruin. Foreign governments watched nervously. In London and Paris, financiers whispered that America had become a reckless gambler, staking her survival on unbacked promises. Yet the gamble held. By 1863, the North's war production surged. Railways expanded. The Army grew stronger. Factories in Pennsylvania and Illinois supplied not only the Union but even neutral nations. The paper dollar, once dismissed as fraud, had become a weapon more powerful than cannon fire. But as the greenback's success grew, so did its enemies. In Congress, a coalition of conservative politicians and banking interests began lobbying for its limitation. They argued that uncontrolled issuance would destroy the economy after the war. Their proposed alternative, a national banking system, privately operated yet federally chartered, a structure that would, in effect, place the nation's money supply under the guardianship of private banks once more. It was sold as reform. The Rothschild, Lincoln's allies, financial dynasty. The National Banking Act of 1863 and 1864 were passed nonetheless. Vienna, each new national bank, their network could transfer millions across borders in hours, but the government would still owe interest unmatched by any government. The conspiracy theorists later claimed the family played both sides of Lincoln's signature, loaning to Washington back into the hands of the financiers he had defied. As always, and this is where the conspiracy is less theatrical yet far more intricate. Some historians see the Rothschild Banking branch as a prototype for a system that would later partly out of moral Reserve, partly because Britain's long-term interests required a stable debate over who truly controls other European financiers, eager for the era, show intense invested in Confederate secret meetings between Treasury officials in Paris and Amsterdam, and drafted legislation written by the line between private enterprise and political manipulation and conspiracy, or simply the inevitable bond sale might shift public opinion in a foreign capital. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, conspiracy theorists decided by general patterns to connect. When now also the war had ended, but his vision of archival money died with him. Legends, the greenback experiment was gradually replaced by the old system of interest, as Confederate fortunes declined and debt. The hunt for money returned to gold redemption. Agents like Jacob Thompson and Clement Clay roamed Canada in the aftermath, negotiating remember that for a brief moment in history, they offered concessions. America had glimpsed another path, even nation funding itself without Southern Empire stretching into Latin America. To some, but investors was Lincoln's greatest legacy. The market was merciless, his greatest threat. It abandoned lost causes as easily as it created. The dream of independence then came a new gravity of finance, one that would survive the enduring belief that unseen hands some claim that European monarchies secretly when the guns fell silent. America that a strong, unified republic might inspire revolutions. It awoke into whispers. If the United States, the war's ending had only revealed another war, it would threaten every throne in corridors of power. By this logic, velvet dividing America was not just strategy. To many in the 19th century, self-preservation. Secret societies were as real as armies. Letters from European diplomats hint at this anxiety. The Knights of the Golden Circle, reports of Paris and the lesser-known order of American Knights, American newspapers and taverns, their rituals were private, movements their members powerful. Better to see the Republic humbled and so the imagination of whether the sentiment ever shaped still trembling from 4 years of carnage. But the fear was real. Search for patterns. By 1865, the Freemasons, Richmond boldest and most respectable. Those fears faded with the smoke. Generals, America had businessmen wore their emblems. Yet in the shadows of the peace, Washington himself laid the cornerstone of the Capitol wearing Masonic regalia. They saw in every banker's to most American foreign ship the fraternity was a symbol of order and enlightenment. They argued that the Civil War was less a moral crusade. It was a shadow chess game. It's stronger than any unseen global hand. Its hand guiding the narrator pauses. Then there was a Knights of the Golden Circle. Perhaps it was not pure fiction. The group that conspiratorial the world was learning a dangerous lesson. Myth. That financial power in the 1850s easily as armies. It dreamed of a southern empire realization the American South every conspiracy and the Caribbean. From whispers about central banks to tales of slaveholding dominion encircling as the 19th century marched on, when war America would rebuild, many believed its members had simply put on Confederate and expand westwards. But some would say that her soul had been mortgaged to the same financiers coded letters to bleed, caches of weapons. And when a new generation historians today debate how much it was fact and how much recall these same names, yet even the rumors same fears, and ask the same question: every unexplained act, truly controls every political motive, its elected every act of sabotage, or those who fund them, could be attributed to the Civil War was not won on the battlefield alone. After Lincoln's assassination, it was also fought in the that hunger for explanation turned ravenous. In the sleeper's mind of a president named John Wilkes Booth and a handful of co-conspirators. By 1861, Abraham Lincoln's greatest knight was not the Confederate Army. That his flight across the South was aided by an underground network of sympathizers. Revenue from terrorists to kill president, vice president, reserves were vanishing. Secretary of State had been born not of vengeance but of policy. Every musket, some went further, every ration, every mile of railroad had demanded money the government did not have. Freemasons, Lincoln turned to the nation's bankers. Even the Illuminati, they met him politely, bound by ancient pledges to preserve hierarchy and crush republicanism. They would lend to them. They said Lincoln was not merely a political interest rate so high. He was a philosophical we lost before it began. The embodiment of self-government and the threat it posed hereditary power. To Lincoln, little hard it smelled like a grand alliance. Then came an idea so radical it bordered on madness. Coded correspondence. The government would create its own aliases. Thus were born the resembling Masonic paper dollars not backed whether coincidence or connection, by the authority of the United States itself. The
Legal
Tender
Tender
Act of 1862 authorized $150 million in nearly every major tragedy. It was a direct challenge to the power of the private banks, the scandals and a miracle for the soldiers, even fires that swept northern cities. The notes were place in this invisible Lincoln's
web.
Rags. If an event seemed too complex to understand, merchants refused them. The public reached for the comfort of a secret cause. But the war was there truly a web of secret societies. The government used its own promise as collateral. Perhaps and only somehow the human need for meaning wove it. The greenback became the lifeblood of the coded letter. Each behind the patriotic cornerstone, however, added another strand to the new suspicion. The years after Lincoln's assassination money were heavy with confusion. What stopped the nation wanted or anyone else? But every scar seemed to hide a secret. Where did value truly Congress come from? Argued over gold, Reconstruction, labor, former Confederates whispered in of secret memos. Some of Lincoln's advisors Richmond and New power would draw men spoke again of the circle, armed rebellion, the lodge, and the unseen hand. Wall Street financially saw in the night of the golden circle finished. If their leaders had fled or succeeded, but newspaper banking might never gain control. Organizations lived on. Some later writers claimed this was a moment when Lincoln signed his own death warrant. The American Knights, not from Southern blood, but some were financial revenge. Others were phantoms. They cited letters, anecdotes. Yet to the ordinary citizens, they were historians dispute a symbol of invisible power. Yet the myth endures. In the shadows, the president who dared to free both men and money challenged such whispers found too easy to forgive him. Federal greenbacks circulated like wildfire. New governments rose and fell like shifting tides, stamped with Lincoln promise and the words United States note. Secret meetings, soldiers night rides, shopkeepers began to trust. They all fueled the belief that North factories roared back to life, strings from fed by a current of money that owed nothing to Ku Klux Klan. But beneath that in 1866, acquired to only strengthened that belief. In the parlors of rituals, financial liberty from fraternal orders, the decision was seen as blasphemy. The man in the White Hierarchies, one knows violence was brutally real, has dared to play God with the nation's line between myth and movement. Bankers feared many Northerners reading newspaper accounts. If the Union could print its own credit, was merely another branch of the same dark tree that conspired against Lincoln. They began to hoard gold, genuine, driving up its price to undermine the greenback's value. Some former Confederate screamed about Lincoln's paper had indeed been associated with earlier nights. Foreign governments, but the notion of a single in London and Paris conspiracy stretching from European America had become a reckless gambler, largely staking a survival on unbacked more than by documents. Yet the gamble held. By 1863, by the 1870s, war productions, the idea of a deeply entrenched network manipulating army groups from behind the scenes had factories in Pennsylvania and Illinois. Writers began to speak of the invisible empire, neutral nations, not only to describe the paper dollar, but to suggest that secret elites might become a weapon more powerful than cannon fire. The phrase greenback success grew. Reborn whenever citizens felt powerless. In Congress, a coalition of conservative politicians and banking interests began lobbying for its limitation. They argued that uncontrolled issuance would destroy the economy after the war. Their proposed alternative, a national banking system, privately operated yet federally chartered, a structure that would, in effect, place the nation's money supply under the guardianship of private banks once more. In Washington, another current was forming, this time among intellectual circles. The Masonic revival, bolstered by veterans seeking fraternity after the war, filled lodges across the North and Midwest. Most were benign, dedicated to charity and moral education. But outsiders saw the sudden resurgence of secrecy as suspicious. Anti-Masonic newspapers warned that the same brotherhood that had guarded the assassin's flight now sat in positions of influence, in banks, in courts, even in Congress. One pamphlet published in 1877 asked bluntly, "Did we trade one rebellion for another, open arms or hidden hands?" It was rhetorical, sensational, and exactly what a traumatized public was ready to believe. In truth, America's post-war turmoil needed no secret cabal to explain it. Economic collapse, racial tension, political corruption, these were enemies enough. Yet belief in hidden masters served as strange comfort. It made chaos seem deliberate. If someone, somewhere, was truly in control, then history itself might still have meaning. So the legend of the web endured. Each generation would weave it anew, replacing the names, changing the symbols, but keeping the same fear that democracy was a mask worn by something older, colder, and unseen. The war was over, yet America's soul was restless. The nation had been torn apart and stitched back together, but the seams still showed. The people dreamed of freedom, progress, and prosperity, but they also feared that something unseen was tightening its grip on the republic. This was not the age of generals anymore. It was the age of magnates, men whose wealth could move mountains and whose signatures could decide the fate of thousands. The battlefields of the New Age were not covered in blood and mud, but in steel and smoke. The sound of cannon fire was replaced by the hiss of steam engines and the clatter of printing presses. And yet, in the hearts of many, the same old suspicion burned, that freedom was being sold, not by invaders, but by financiers and industrialists within their own borders. The railroad became the arteries of the nation, pumping life and money across the continent. But those who controlled them soon discovered a power even greater than transport. They controlled influence. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Leland Stanford, names once unknown, now loom like monarchs over the Republic. Their companies bought land, crushed competition, and bribed politicians to secure their empires. To ordinary Americans, these men seemed untouchable, modern kings in a land that claimed to have no throne. When the Panic of 1873 struck, that illusion shattered. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Families who had once believed in progress lost everything overnight. And the people began to whisper that the crash had not been an accident, that someone had pulled the plug on purpose. Rumors spread through saloons and newspapers. A cabal of Wall Street bankers had deliberately triggered the collapse to seize assets, consolidate wealth, and enslave the nation through debt. They called it the money power. In the smoky taverns of New York and Chicago, people told stories of men who met in secret, not with swords or oaths, but with ledgers and contracts. They claimed the new conspirators no longer hid behind religion or aristocracy. They hid behind balance sheets. A worker in Ohio might curse his wages, believing that some unseen banker in London or New York had set the price of his labor. A farmer in Kansas might look at falling crop prices and imagine a shadowy hand manipulating markets. True or not, it felt real because power had become invisible. By the 1880s, America had entered what historians would call the Gilded Age, but to many, it was a golden mask covering iron chains. Wealth pooled in fewer and fewer hands. Politicians bowed to business interests. Newspapers were bought and silenced. And for those who remember the old conspiracies, the knights, the lodges, the foreign hands, this was their evolution. No longer cloaked in secrecy or mysticism, power now wore a banker's suit. The conspiracies of the New Age were not whispered in dark alleys, but signed in boardrooms. Publicly, men like J.P. Morgan were hailed as geniuses of finance, rescuers of markets. Privately, critics accused them of orchestrating collapses only to appear as saviors. And so the legend grew that the Civil War had only been the beginning, a rehearsal for a greater takeover. That the dream of democracy was quietly yielding to corporatocracy, ruled by the rich, veiled as progress. It was in this cauldron of suspicion that the word trust gained new meaning. The great industrial trusts, oil, rail, steel, became symbols of hidden empires. Ordinary citizens began to ask questions that echo even today. Who truly governs a nation? The people who vote, or the people who lend? As the century turned and the electric light replaced the lantern, one truth remained in the dark. Every age finds its own conspiracy, because every age fears the same thing, the loss of control. And though the names had changed, the whispers had not. From the shadows of Reconstruction to the skyscrapers of New York, the idea of unseen hands guiding America's destiny endured, stronger, subtler, and more believable than ever. The new century dawned not with a bang, but with a whisper, the hum of telegraphs, the clatter of ticker tape, and the shuffle of paper fortunes built and lost in minutes. America was now an empire of commerce, and its throne stood not in Washington, but on Wall Street. In the eyes of many, the Civil War had ended slavery of the body. But in its place, a new kind of bondage had emerged, economic slavery, hidden behind the elegant language of finance. At the center of it all stood one man, John Pierpont Morgan. A towering figure with cold eyes and a calm voice, Morgan didn't need an army. He had something far more powerful, trust, not the moral kind, but the financial kind. When the government faltered, Morgan lent money. When industries collapsed, Morgan bought them. When markets panicked, Morgan soothed them, or so it seemed. In 1907, America was struck by a terrifying financial crisis. Banks failed, the stock market plunged, and panic swept the nation. But while the public rushed to withdraw their savings, one man stood firm. Morgan, the private citizen, called the nation's most powerful bankers to his library in New York. Behind closed doors, he locked them in until a solution was found. When morning came, the panic was over. The newspapers hailed Morgan as a hero, the man who saved America. But others whispered a darker version of the story. They said the crisis had been engineered, that Morgan and his allies had intentionally squeezed the system to prove a point, that America needed a central bank, one that they would ultimately control. Whether by chance or design, the panic achieved its purpose. 6 years later, in 1913, the U.S. government passed the Federal Reserve Act, and with it, handed the nation's money supply to a new, mysterious power, a consortium of private banks operating under a federal name. It was called the Federal Reserve. But it was neither truly federal nor held in reserve. Critics shouted betrayal. They claimed that the nation's financial sovereignty had been sold to a cabal of international bankers, the same interest that had funded wars, influenced kings, and now sought to rule republics. Senator Charles Lindbergh, one of its fiercest opponents, warned, "The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. The invisible government by the money power is now legalized." And the people listened, for to them, it felt like history repeating itself, the same old story of elites shaping nations for profit. From the ashes of the Civil War to the boardrooms of Manhattan, the same accusation echoed, that bloodshed and banking were two sides of the same coin. But the mystery deepened when investigators traced the origins of the Federal Reserve Act to a secret meeting held years earlier, not in Washington, not in New York, but on a private island off the coast of Georgia. The place was called Jekyll Island. In 1910, under the cover of darkness, a small group of men boarded a private rail car with no markings. They spoke in code, used fake names, and carried documents that would alter the world. Among them were representatives of the nation's most powerful banks, Morgan, Rockefeller, and Rothschild. For 10 days, they drafted what would become the framework of the Federal Reserve. When the public learned of it years later, outrage spread like wildfire. To the skeptics, it was proof that the money trust had conspired to seize control of the United States from within, a bloodless coup hidden in plain sight. The press called it the Aldrich Plan, named after Senator Nelson Aldrich, who conveniently was also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. to conspiracy theorists. This was no coincidence. It was bloodline strategy. The Federal Reserve would issue money, set interest rates, and control the nation's credit, all behind closed doors. And though the law declared it a government institution, its structure placed ultimate power in the hands of private bankers. The old republic of farmers and frontiersmen had given birth to an empire of financiers, and once again, the invisible strings of history seemed to tighten. For some, it was progress, the natural evolution of a modern economy. For others, it was confirmation that the Civil War had not been fought to end slavery, but to transform it, from chains of iron to chains of debt. The men of the money trust had no need for battlefields. Their victories were silent. Their wars were fought on paper. And their empire was the American dream itself. The year was 1914. Europe stood at the edge of a storm. Kings and ministers believed they were masters of fate, yet the true architects of war often wore no crown. They signed no declarations, commanded no armies, yet their reach extended across continents. When the first gunfire echoed in Sarajevo, few could imagine how that single shot would reshape the world. The old empires of Europe, Britain, France, Austria, Germany, and Russia plunged into chaos. And across the ocean, America watched and waited. But some believed the United States was never truly neutral. According to certain researchers and theorists, the hidden hand of finance was already at work, guiding nations toward a conflict that would transform global power forever. They point first to a single, pivotal truth. Wars create debt, and debt, in turn, creates control. During the Civil War, private bankers had discovered a simple formula: lend money to governments in crisis, charge interest, and use that leverage to shape policy. By the early 20th century, that formula had become an art form. As Europe marched toward war, the same banking dynasties that had financed railroads, industries, and nations now prepared for the largest venture in human history, the financing of global conflict. J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn-Loeb, the Rothschilds, the warbugs, their names echo through history, attached to both brilliance and suspicion. Publicly, they were seen as stabilizers of the world economy. But behind closed doors, some whispered that their wealth depended on both sides of war. Even before the U.S. entered the conflict, American banks were quietly lending billions of dollars to Britain and France. Factories in the Midwest churned out weapons, shells, and uniforms long before a single American soldier marched to Europe. To the public, America was a bystander. To those who looked closer, it was a supplier, an investor, and perhaps a stakeholder. By 1916, the British war effort was faltering. Its coffers were drained. The Royal Navy, once the pride of the empire, was struggling to pay for American goods. That's when Morgan's network stepped in. In New York, his firm became the official purchasing agent for the British and French governments, controlling over 70% of all Allied war materials purchased from the United States. Every bullet, every boot, every grain of wheat that crossed the Atlantic passed through Morgan's hands. But Morgan was not alone. The Warburg family, with deep ties to both German and American finance, became a symbol of divided loyalty and hidden influence. Paul Warburg, a founding architect of the Federal Reserve, advised U.S. financial policy, while his brother Max Warburg sat on the board of the Reichsbank in Germany. For the skeptics, this was proof that nationality mattered less than network. They claimed that wars were not merely between nations, but between investments, a way to balance global accounts by blood and credit. To historians, these overlaps might be coincidence, but to believers in the great manipulation, they were chess moves. When the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, killing 128 Americans, outrage swept the United States. Officially, the German submarine attack was condemned as barbaric, but whispers spread that the ship had been carrying munitions to Britain, hidden beneath civilian cargo. And some claimed the tragedy had been allowed to happen, even provoked, to draw America closer to war. The same pattern, they argued, had been seen before, and would be seen again. As President Wilson prepared to lead a reluctant nation into battle, his campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," began to sound like prophecy's cruel joke. Behind the scenes, Wilson had already surrounded himself with financial advisors, many with direct ties to the banking world that had supported his rise. One of them was Colonel Edward House, a man whose influence seemed to shadow every major decision in the White House. He was not a soldier, nor a politician, but a thinker, and some say, a messenger of hidden powers. House wrote a book in 1912, Philip Drew, Administrator, in which he imagined a benevolent dictatorship guiding America toward a new world order of efficiency and control. It was fiction, but critics later saw it as a manifesto, a blueprint for centralized global governance under elite guidance. And so, when America entered the war in 1917, it did so under a banner of making the world safe for democracy, yet financed by men whose loyalty lay not to flags, but to figures. The war machine roared to life. Liberty bonds were sold to citizens, urging them to support the boys overseas. But behind the patriotic posters lay a complex web of loans, intricate, layered, and profitable. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, America had lent over $10 billion to the Allies. Europe lay in ruins. And for the first time in history, global debt became the new currency of power. The aftermath of the Great War brought more than sorrow, it brought realignment. Old empires collapsed. Borders were redrawn. Monarchies vanished. And as the dust settled, the world turned to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, the supposed meeting of hope. But even there, the familiar faces of finance and diplomacy reappeared. Bankers, economists, and advisors hovered around the tables of Versailles. The victors debated punishment and reparation. But to critics, it looked less like justice and more like a financial restructuring of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles demanded enormous payment from Germany, sums impossible to pay without borrowing. And who would provide those loans? The same financial houses that had financed the war itself. For conspiracy historians, this was the ultimate cycle: create conflict, fund both sides, and profit from the reconstruction. They called it the debt trap. By 1920, the world was no longer ruled by kings or soldiers. It was ruled by balance sheets, gold reserves, and the quiet whispers of men in private rooms. And the greatest whisper of all was a question few dared to ask aloud. Was the First World War a tragedy of nations or a transaction of empires? As the decade rolled forward, the world danced to the rhythm of the Jazz Age, fast, loud, and full of hope. But beneath the music, something darker stirred. A machine built on speculation, and debt was humming too loudly to ignore. The stock market soared. Fortunes were made overnight. And once again, the invisible hand seemed to tighten, not in violence, but in temptation. By the time the crash came in 1929, it was not just an economic collapse. It was a collapse of faith. People no longer trusted banks, leaders, or even democracy itself. And once again, the theorists spoke up, warning that the same powers who had profited from war were now resetting the system through economic chaos. To them, it wasn't coincidence. It was calculation. In every century, the form of control changes, but its essence remains the same. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of credit. And in the shadows between truth and myth, the question of the hidden hand endures. As nations struggle to rebuild and ordinary people search for hope, few realize that the seeds of the next great conflict were already being planted, in banks, in treaties, and in the quiet corridors of power. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, yet the world remained restless. Cities smoldered, debts piled high, and the victors were divided by the cost of their own triumph. The dream of peace, promised in 1918, began to fade beneath the weight of Reconstruction loans and political fatigue. In Europe, new nations were born overnight. Boundaries were redrawn by pens instead of swords, but the ink carried its own danger. Each new border meant new credit, new borrowing, new dependency. Behind every treaty clause and reparations schedule stood the quiet arithmetic of the bankers who financed recovery. The 1920s promised prosperity, the return to normalcy. But the normal world had vanished. Factories rebuilt for wartime production now searched for purpose. Armament makers turned to automobiles and machines. Speculation replaced labor as the fastest path to wealth. Across the Atlantic, America became the lender of last resort. European governments sent envoys to Wall Street, where fortunes could be raised with a handshake. To the public, this was proof of American leadership. To the skeptics, it looked like a new empire, an empire of credit replacing the old empires of conquest. The doors were. In 1924, a plan appeared to solve the impossible tangle of German reparations and Allied debts. It was called the Dawes Plan, named after an American banker and politician, Charles G. Dawes. Under the plan, U.S. investors would lend Germany the money to pay reparations to Britain and France, who would in turn pay back their own debts to the United States. Money would flow in a circle, interest added at every turn. To economists, it was a brilliant piece of engineering. To others, it was a purest symbol of manipulation, an international merry-go-round powered by the same financiers who had profited from the war itself. The critics asked, if every nation owes money to the same network of banks, who truly owns a piece? The Dawes Plan worked, for a while. The German mark stabilized, factories reopened, and optimism returned. But beneath the surface, the system depended on endless credit, and credit depends on confidence. When confidence falters, the machine stops. Shadows of the market. By 1928, Wall Street was a carnival of excess. Brokers shouted, papers fluttered, and every office clerk dreamed of becoming a millionaire. The U.S. market drew capital from across the globe, including the same European funds meant for Reconstruction. Money chased itself in circles, and the hum of speculation grew louder than the hum of industry. Then, in October 1929, silence. The crash came like a sudden storm. Stocks collapsed, banks closed, and the invisible empire of credit cracked apart. Factories went dark, farmers burned crops they couldn't sell, and families lined up for bread in cities that had once glittered. To historians, the Great Depression was a result of overconfidence, poor regulation, and economic imbalance. To conspiracy theorists, it was a deliberate reset of a system grown too independent. An engineered collapse meant to gather power back into fewer hands. They pointed to how swiftly major banks consolidated after the crash. While small institutions failed by the thousands, the largest survived, absorbing their rivals and their customers' debts. Within a few short years, the financial landscape looked smaller, tighter, more centralized than ever before. The rise of new powers. In the ruins of the Depression, desperation bred extremism. Across Europe, charismatic leaders promised renewal. Factories reopened, armies expanded, and flags of revival were raised. But every revival required funding, and funding required someone willing to lend. Industrial giants from many nations sought profit wherever it could be found. Steel for construction, oil for engines, chemical for industry. Some historians note that international business connections crossed political lines, providing resources that, years later, would feed the next global conflict. To the conspiracy-minded, these commercial links looked like proof of a hidden alliance of profit, indifferent to ideology or morality. As the 1930s advanced, secret rearmament projects multiplied. Diplomats preached peace while factories in multiple countries manufactured weapons under coded budgets. Loans were disguised as trade credits, and shipments moved under neutral flags. The pattern looked familiar: investment, escalation, and crisis. Was it repetition by accident, or by design? The architects of order. In 1930, a new institution appeared quietly in the Swiss city of Basel, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS. Officially, it existed to handle German reparations and coordinate central banks. Unofficially, it became a meeting place where the world's financial leaders could speak freely beyond the reach of parliaments and reporters. Its neutrality and secrecy earned it both admiration and suspicion. For supporters, the BIS was a symbol of cooperation, proof that finance could transcend politics. For critics, it was the heart of the so-called money trust, a hidden parliament of bankers shaping nations behind closed doors. They saw in it the continuation of a pattern stretching back to the Civil War. Crises leading to concentration, concentration leading to control. Meanwhile, in the United States, the New Deal sought to rescue the economy through regulation and reform. Yet even as government agencies multiplied, the Federal Reserve and its private partners remained the backbone of the credit system. For many Americans, this raised a haunting question: had democracy saved capitalism, or had capitalism absorbed democracy? Toward the gathering storm. By the late 1930s, the world was rearming openly. Newsreels showed parades of soldiers, columns of tanks, fleets of new aircraft. Peace conferences came and went, but contract for munitions grew longer. Speculators once again saw opportunity. Materials, shipping, insurance, every sector connected to war began to rise. The lesson of the Great War had not been forgotten. Conflict, for some, was still the most profitable enterprise on earth. When Europe finally ignited in 1939, the pattern completed itself. Loans flowed, industries surged, and the neutral nations became suppliers to all sides. The same newspapers that printed headlines of horror also carried advertisements for bonds and investment funds. War and profit marched together, step for step. Yet for all the dark theories, another truth endured. Countless individuals, from clerks to soldiers to factory workers, acted with no scheme in mind, only survival. History is not written by conspirators alone. It is also written by millions of ordinary people swept along by events too vast to see in full. Still, the suspicion persisted. As the Second World War grew into a global cataclysm, people asked again the oldest question of all: who benefits? Was the modern age guided by the invisible hand of markets, or by the invisible hand of men who built those markets? Did chaos breed opportunity, or did opportunity create chaos? The answers were as elusive as ever, lost somewhere between archives and imagination. But one thing was certain: every crisis leaves behind structures of control stronger than before, and every reconstruction creates new debts to be repaid in the next generation. In 1945, the victors wrote the history books. They spoke of justice, democracy, and the birth of a new world order. But deep within the newly formed institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, some saw something else taking root: control through cooperation. The idea was elegant. If nations could be bound by debt, dependency, and diplomacy, then direct conquest would no longer be necessary. The map of influence could be redrawn not with armies, but with signatures. It was said that while the politicians smiled for the cameras at San Francisco and Bretton Woods, another kind of negotiation was taking place out of sight, where power flowed not through speeches but through numbers on a ledger. Who truly benefited from this new order? To the conspiracy-minded, it wasn't nations at all. It was networks, of bankers, industrialists, and intelligence officers who understood that secrecy itself was the most valuable currency of all. They weren't kings, nor presidents, nor generals. They were the men who moved between them. Some were corporate executives from America's biggest industrial firms. Others were European financiers who had survived the war intact. Many had connections that stretched back to the era before the trenches of 1914, families and foundations whose wealth had weathered every storm. To the public, they were the sponsors of peace. To the skeptics, they were its engineers and its owners. The historian Carroll Quigley once hinted that world events often follow the interests of financial dynasties who preferred to stay hidden, shaping systems rather than seizing thrones. Whether coincidence or coordination, one thing was clear. Power was becoming abstract. You couldn't see it anymore. You could only feel its weight. In Washington, the victory parades were still echoing through the streets when a new agency quietly emerged from the war's intelligence apparatus, the Central Intelligence Agency. Officially, it was built to defend democracy. Unofficially, it became the perfect instrument for influence, one that operated in shadows even Congress couldn't fully see. Soon, the CIA was not only gathering information but shaping the outcomes of elections abroad, funding revolutions, and protecting corporate interests under the banner of national security. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB was doing the same. The world was now divided by ideology, but united by espionage. Some claimed this division was never as real as it appeared, that both sides, East and West, were being guided toward perpetual tension, a Cold War that benefited those who profited from conflict. Arms manufacturers, energy magnates, and intelligence networks thrived in an environment where peace was always promised but never delivered. The conspiracy's central claim grew louder. What if the Cold War was designed not to destroy, but to control? In the years immediately after 1945, rumors swirled of secret programs that smuggled former Nazi scientists, intelligence officers, and industrial experts into Western nations. Officially, it was to use their knowledge for defense. Unofficially, some believed it was to preserve the very networks that had once served darker masters. Project Paperclip became a real name in declassified files, but in the conspiracy world, it symbolized something greater, the idea that evil had not been defeated, merely rebranded. These men, it was said, carried with them not just scientific knowledge, but ideological frameworks. They became advisors, consultants, and corporate strategists, quietly building the foundation for a world where loyalty to nations mattered less than loyalty to systems. Systems of power, systems of profit, systems that would survive any flag. By the late 1940s, propaganda became a new kind of weapon. The fear of communism spread like wildfire through the Western world, just as fear of capitalism consumed the East. But fear itself was a constant, and fear was profitable. Governments poured billions into military research, industrial mobilization, and media manipulation. The war industries had found a new justification. And through it all, the lines between government and corporation blurred. The same executives who sat in boardrooms by day attended policy meetings by night. Deals were made not for nations, but for networks. The people believed they were living through an ideological struggle. The conspiracists believed they were watching a global theater, one designed to keep populations obedient and economies active. Then came whispers of secret pacts, of global defense treaties and economic alignments that were never publicly debated. NATO, CETO, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, each was celebrated as a triumph of Western unity. But beneath the surface, conspiracy theorists saw something else, the slow construction of an empire without borders. Instead of colonies, there were bases. Instead of governors, there were trade officials and intelligence liaisons. The tools had changed, but the intent, control, remained. Some said the American century was not a celebration of freedom, but a carefully orchestrated shift of global dependence, moving the center of power from London to Washington. Others went further, suggesting that this transition was itself part of a larger plan, one to centralize control under a small, unelected elite. Whether true or not, the patterns were undeniable. The same few corporations supplied the world's energy, the same few banks managed its debt, and the same few alliances dictated its wars. The story of the 20th century, some whispered, was not the story of nations at all. It was a story of continuity, of systems that survived kings, wars, and revolutions by simply changing their uniforms. The faces on the coins changed. The flags on the embassies changed. But the balance sheets, the pipelines, and the power brokers remained. And as the world entered the 1950s, with a nuclear age dawning and the Iron Curtain dividing the planet, one question began to echo among the few who still looked behind the headlines. Was humanity finally free, or had it simply entered a new kind of captivity, one so sophisticated, so invisible, that it could never be seen? The dawn of the 1950s painted the world in two colors, red and blue. But the truth, some whispered, was shaded in gray. Beneath the slogans of freedom and revolution, another order was quietly solidifying, one that thrived not on open warfare, but on the quiet balance of tension. The Cold War was a theater, and behind its curtains moved the real actors, financiers, industrialists, and strategists who understood that global fear could be the most reliable business model ever devised. While the newspapers shouted of ideological wars, contracts worth billions were signed in the shadows, contracts that bound governments to corporations, and corporations to unseen benefactors. The Cold War, it seemed, had become the perfect perpetual motion machine. As long as fear existed, production would continue. As long as production continued, profits would flow. And as long as profits flowed, the hidden empire would live on. The world power was no longer concentrated in castles or palaces. It now flowed through cables, briefcases, and encrypted telegrams. Intelligence agencies became the new monarchies. Their secrets could topple regimes or protect them. The CIA, MI6, the KGB, and a dozen others became more than guardians of nations. They were the architect of reality itself. They shaped what the public saw, what the press reported, and what the textbooks recorded. Conspiracists pointed to events that seemed too convenient to be random: the coups in Iran and Guatemala, the strange rise and fall of leaders across Africa and Latin America, the sudden alignment of foreign economies with Western interests. Each event was a ripple, they claimed, in a global current that flowed towards centralization. And when anyone questioned it, they were silenced not by force, but by ridicule. The term conspiracy theorist itself became a weapon, a way to disarm the curious and protect the powerful. By the mid-20th century, a new kind of empire had emerged, one built not on land, but on logos. Oil companies, defense contractors, and financial institutions had become nations unto themselves. Their influence spanned continents. Their revenues exceeded the GDPs of entire countries, and their loyalty was owed only to shareholders, not citizens. In boardrooms from Manhattan to Geneva, global strategies were being written, decisions that would shape wars, economies, and the environment for generations to come. To the ordinary worker, these forces were invisible. But to the conspiracy-minded, they were the modern emperors, ruling without borders, elections, or flags. Some even whispered that wars were planned not for ideology, but for inventory, that conflict was scheduled to clear stockpiles and justify new investments. To those who benefited, peace was not profitable. When the guns quieted, another kind of battle began, a war for the mind. Television, once a marvel of communication, became a tool of persuasion. Governments learned how to craft narratives that unified citizens in belief, even when the truth lay elsewhere. Operation Mockingbird became one of those whispered names, an alleged program in which journalists were not observers, but participants in a global theater of influence. Whether myth or memory, it captured the growing fear that truth itself was being managed. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of the hidden empire. When fact became flexible and history became a script, control required no chains. In the 1960s, the world trembled at the edge of annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the arms race, the threat of total destruction, all of it kept billions in a constant state of dread. But to the cynics, this was a perfect equilibrium. Neither side could afford to destroy the other. The tension itself became the product. Military spending soared, research expanded, and surveillance spread to every corner of life. Satellites looked down from the heavens, and the world's first computer networks began to hum with data, recording, categorizing, and predicting human behavior. It was no longer just about controlling nations. It was about managing the planet itself. The term military-industrial complex was born, first spoken by President Eisenhower in a warning that sounded more like a confession. He cautioned that the merger of arms and policy could lead to a power too great for democracy to restrain. The conspiracy theorists nodded. They had been saying the same thing all along. By the 1970s, wars no longer needed declarations. They happened in markets, in media, and in minds. Every revolution was televised. Every crisis was monetized. Every tragedy became an opportunity. Beneath the flags, the same invisible lines connected politicians, bankers, and magnates. Intelligence networks had evolved into data networks, and secrecy had become infrastructure. The Cold War had begun as a struggle for ideology, but it was ending as a framework for management. Two superpowers played their roles perfectly, keeping the world divided and predictable, while beneath them, the same global machinery expanded without pause. And through it all, the people kept working, buying, and believing, unaware that the peace they celebrated was just another design. As the century neared its end, one thing became clear. Power had become intangible. It was no longer about territory or treasure, but information. Whoever controlled communication controlled perception, and whoever controlled perception controlled reality itself. The hidden empire was not a government, nor a cabal. It was a system, one that rewarded secrecy, punished transparency, and evolved faster than any society it governed. To the believers of the conspiracy, this was humanity's quiet captivity, a world that had traded its chains for comfort and its freedom for convenience. The empires of the past had fallen with thunder and blood. This one rose with whispers and screams. The war that began in 1861 with muskets and manifestos had become, by the 1980s, a silent, global machine. The American Civil War had reshaped nations, but the wars that followed reshaped the world itself, until history's greatest power no longer wore a uniform or raised a flag. It wore a suit. It signed contracts. It smiled for cameras while it pulled strings unseen. And as humanity stepped into the digital age, one question remained. If the hidden empire was real, could it ever be defeated? Or was it already inside every system we trusted, every institution we obeyed, and every screen we watched? The 20th century ended not with a roar of cannons, but with a soft hum of machines. The old empires had fallen. The flags had changed. The ideologies had burned out. But something new was rising, something invisible, silent, and absolute. It began in the wires, in the circuits, in the code. The same technology that promised liberation also carried the seeds of control. The world was connecting, faster, closer, tighter than ever before. And yet, with every connection, another layer of privacy disappeared. By the time the Cold War's final curtain fell, humanity celebrated what it believed was freedom. Walls were torn down. Markets opened. The great superpowers shook hands beneath banners of peace. But deep within the algorithms and databases of this new world, the architecture of power was being rebuilt again, smarter, quieter, and far more durable than before. In the 1990s, computers moved from laboratories to living rooms. The Internet, once a military experiment, became a marketplace and a playground. It was hailed as the dawn of the information age, a revolution that would bring democracy to knowledge and equality to opportunity. Yet, as users flooded online, they unknowingly built the foundation of a new kind of empire, one that required no armies, no kings, no flags. For the first time in history, information itself became the most valuable resource on Earth. Every search, every message, every transaction, tiny fragments of human life, were quietly collected, stored, and sold. Companies promised connection, but delivered surveillance. Governments promised transparency, but built new walls of secrecy behind digital encryption. To the believers of the conspiracy, this was no accident. It was evolution, the hidden empire adapting to the digital age. No longer did power need to hide in smoke-filled rooms or behind fortress walls. It lived in servers, algorithms, and invisible lines of code. In ancient times, gold and oil were the lifeblood of empires. Now, it was data. Every click, every purchase, every word whispered into a smartphone microphone became currency. Corporations competed to own it, governments raced to regulate it, and individuals gave it away for convenience. The trade was simple: freedom for comfort, privacy for connection, identity for access. And few noticed it happening. The conspiracists called it a voluntary captivity. Humanity, they said, had built its own prison and named it Progress. The walls were made of terms and conditions. The guards were digital assistants. The chains were notifications that never stopped ringing. And all the while, a new elite emerged, not of generals or politicians, but of technocrats, programmers, investors, and executives who understood that whoever controlled information could control everything else. They didn't conquer nations, they acquired them. They didn't overthrow governments, they partnered with them. And soon, even presidents and parliaments began to defer to the quiet power of networks too complex to fully understand. It was no longer fashionable to speak of control or conspiracy. The language had changed. What once was called propaganda became targeted advertising. What once was called surveillance became user analytics. And what once was called censorship became content moderation. The shift was so seamless that most people didn't notice. The very words that had once warned of tyranny were redefined as tools of innovation. The hidden empire, it seemed, had not vanished. It had rebranded. Where kings once sat upon thrones, CEOs now stood on stages in black turtlenecks, preaching innovation as gospel. Where soldiers once enforced obedience, now algorithms decided what billions saw, thought, and believed. To many, this was progress, a peaceful, efficient, interconnected world. But to the skeptics, it was a perfect illusion. Because in this new system, control required no force. The people policed themselves. They revealed their secrets willingly, sought validation from machines, and accepted convenience as currency. Freedom had been redefined, not as the absence of control, but as participation in it. The 21st century ushered in something far more powerful than any single government or corporation: artificial intelligence. At first, it was simple, machines learning to recognize faces, voices, and patterns. But soon, these systems began predicting behavior, shaping decisions, and rewriting the fabric of human interaction. Social networks no longer just connected people. They curated their reality. The news no longer informed. It influenced. And the line between truth and narrative blurred into a new digital fog. Some theorists believe that this was a moment when humanity lost control entirely, not to a dictator or a nation, but to its own reflection. The algorithms had learned what humans wanted: attention, approval, and affirmation, and they gave it back in infinite supply. Each like, each share, each notification was another thread tightening around the mind. The empire no longer needed to hide. It lived inside every screen. Borders became less important. Elections became predictable. Cultures blended and blurred until individuality itself began to dissolve into global sameness. Entertainment replaced education. Trends replaced truth. People stopped asking questions, not because they were forbidden to, but because the system was designed to keep them too distracted to care. To the conspiracists, this was a final stage, the dream of total control realized through voluntary surrender. No need for secret societies or backroom deals. Humanity had connected itself so completely that it no longer needed chains. The illusion of freedom was complete. By the 2020s, a new kind of conflict had begun, not over land, but over information itself. Cyber attacks replaced invasions. Leaked data replaced spies. And global influence was measured not in nuclear warheads, but in terabytes. Nations accused each other of manipulation, interference, and surveillance. But behind the headlines, the infrastructure was eerily similar on both sides. The same systems of monitoring, the same methods of persuasion, the same invisible agreements to keep the network intact. And once again, just as in the old wars, the people were told they were enemies, while the architect of the system quietly profited from both sides. The Cold War had gone digital. The hidden empire had gone global. And in this new world, there were no borders, only servers. The smoke of the old world had faded, yet its ashes whispered in every wind. America stood triumphant after the Civil War, but beneath that triumph lay something darker, a web spun from the same silk that once bound the hearts of men to slavery. Only now, the chains were invisible. The railroads had stretched across the land like veins of iron, carrying not only coal and steel but secrets, contracts signed in blood and gold, industries born from the war's destruction. Those who had profited from both sides now wore new masks: philanthropists, bankers, visionaries. Yet behind their smiles glimmered the same cold ambition that had once driven them to fund the cannons. As the century turned, the United States entered an age of machines. The telegraph became the telephone, and whispers turned into electric impulses. The war had taught them one lesson above all. Control the lines of communication, and you control the story. Newspapers no longer spoke truth. They shaped it, and those who owned the presses owned the people. A few men rose to divine power: Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie. To the world, they were industrial saviors. To those who looked deeper, they were architects of empire. Each held a belief that chaos could be turned into order if only they could pull the right strings. The blood of the Civil War had dried, but it had fertilized a new crop, the illusion of freedom in an age of quiet obedience. Every new invention promised liberation: the light bulb, the motor car, the airplane. Yet with every promise came a new form of dependence. The people grew to need what they could not understand, to trust those who made the miracles happen. The rich built cities, the poor built dreams. And while the flags still wave in the wind, the soul of the republic began to drift. The First World War came and went, and again America played both savior and merchant. The same names appeared on the ledgers. The same families grew richer. The same shadow moved beneath the stars and stripes. Some claimed it was a legacy of the Freemasons, others a quiet work of the old Confederate financiers who had never accepted defeat. But one idea bound them all: if the old world could be remade by war, then the new world could be ruled by peace, a peace built on dependency, debt, and distraction. Then came the Great Depression. The illusion shattered. Millions fell into despair while a handful rose to godlike wealth. The people cried for salvation, and the architect of control offered them one: a new deal, a new beginning, a new myth. The government would save the nation, but who, then, save the government? For those who looked behind the curtain, the answer was clear. The bankers who had funded both sides of the Civil War now held the pen that wrote America's future. They had conquered not with armies, but with numbers. Gold had become paper. Paper had become power. And as the Second World War erupted, that power was cemented. Once again, the United States applied both the weapons and the ideology. And once again, it emerged as a hero, the land of liberty, shining upon the hill. But beneath that light, a darker flame burned. It was whispered that the Cold War was not a war at all, but a theater, a play between two actors reading from the same script. Capitalism and communism, each feeding the other, each justifying the existence of the other. The same companies that built the bomb also built the bunkers. The same men who warned of tyranny funded it in secret. By mid-century, a new weapon had been born, not of steel or fire, but of code and image. Propaganda had evolved into entertainment. The television became the altar of the modern home, and the family gathered around it to worship illusion. The war for hearts and minds had begun again, only now it wore a smile. Those who had once ruled the railroads now ruled the airwaves. They learned that truth could be rewritten, not with lies, but with repetition. Tell a story long enough, and it becomes reality. Show an image often enough, and it becomes memory. And somewhere in the depths of power, an idea took root, that a nation could be conquered without ever firing a shot, if only its people could be made to love their chains. From the ashes of the old Civil War rose a new civil order, one of information, distraction, and control. And the people, still waving their flags, still singing their songs, never noticed that the empire they had fought to destroy had simply changed its form. The 20th century ended not with a bang, but with a signal. The hum of machines replaced the drums of war. The same nation that had once torn itself apart with bayonets now rebuilt itself with circuits and screens. Every home became a fortress of comfort and a cell of surveillance. Freedom was now a product, sold in pixels and passwords. The new rulers did not wear crowns or uniforms. They wore suits, sat behind glass towers, and spoke the language of data. They promised connection, progress, and safety, and the people believed them, as they had always believed. But deep down, a familiar pattern had returned. The lines that once divided north and south were redrawn, not on maps, but on minds. The algorithm replaced the cannon. The feed replaced the battlefield. Every click became a vote, every post a confession. And still, few realized they were living inside the same experiment that began centuries ago, the testing ground for control. The American Civil War had been its prototype, and now, in the age of the invisible empire, its perfection had arrived. Some scholars whispered that the bloodlines of the old power still pulsed beneath the skin of modern corporations. The heirs of those who funded the first great divide had merely adapted. Where once they invested in bullets, now they invested in bandwidth. Where once they shaped history with money, now they shaped it with information. The masses were distracted by choice, their outrage curated, their opinions predicted, their passions engineered. The dream of liberty had become a brand. The revolution was televised, then digitized, then forgotten. As wars moved overseas, the true battlefield came home, inside the mind of every citizen. The government and the corporations, enemies on paper, partners in silence, had learned to weaponize attention. The more the people watched, the less they saw. Every headline, every scandal, every trending outrage, all threads of a greater design. A design that traced its origins to the moment one half of America turned its guns on the other. The same forces that divided men by color and creed now divided them by code and culture. The flag was still there, but its meaning had splintered into 1,000 reflections, each claiming to be the truth. And behind it all, the architects smiled. They had long ago learned that total control required no chains, no whips, no prisons, only comfort, distraction, and the illusion of choice. Give the people everything they desire, and they will never notice what they've lost. Somewhere in the archives of forgotten history lies a ledger, its ink faded but its truth eternal. On one side, the names of those who died believing they were free. On the other, the few who understood that freedom itself had become the ultimate illusion. The old empire of the Civil War had not died. It had evolved through Wall Street, through Washington, through Silicon Valley. Its generals were no longer soldiers, but technologists, financiers, and policymakers. Its weapons were no longer musket, but algorithms, viruses, and lies. And yet, amid the silence, a question lingers, the same question that haunted Lincoln as he looked across a divided nation. What is freedom, if not the right to think for oneself? The answer has grown harder to find. The more information surrounds us, the less truth we see. Every era has its slaves, and every age its masters. In this new dawn, both are hidden behind screens. The Civil War, they say, ended in 1865. But if you listen closely to the hum of servers, the endless chatter of news feeds, the invisible echo of division, you might realize it never truly ended at all. It simply changed its language. The battlefield is everywhere. The soldiers are us. The war is within. And as a digital sun rises over a world more connected than ever before, the old shadow of control smiles quietly, for it is won not by force, but by faith. Faith that the illusion of freedom is enough to keep the empire alive forever. And so, the story comes full circle. The American Civil War, born of blood, forged in fire, remembered in myth, was never just a war of brother against brother. It was the birth of a machine that feeds on belief, thrives on division, and endures by convincing its captives they are free. The names have changed. The weapons have changed. But the game, the ancient, endless game, remains the same. As long as people chase comfort over truth, illusion over understanding, there will always be another war, invisible, eternal, and meticulously designed. And somewhere, in the unseen chambers of power, the architect of control will keep writing the next chapter. Because history, after all, is not written by the victors. It is written by those who decide what victory means.